Good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pavla Niklova. I'm a member of the board of the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you at today's lecture by Professor Charles Sabatos. We would like to thank Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, who are the co-organizers of this lecture series that we call Literature by and About Czech and Slovak Jews. Also, I'd like to thank Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association and the Czech Minister of Foreign Affairs for their kind financial support of our programs. The Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews was founded in 1961. Its mission at the time was to foster and disseminate knowledge about the history and culture of Jews in the Czech and Slovak lands. By the 1980s, the Society had also assumed a leadership role in organizing the annual memorial service held in New York City to honor Czechoslovak Jews who perished in the Shoah, a tradition that began in 1946 and continues today. The service has taken place at the Bohemian National Hall since its reopening in 2008. The Society published a 3-volume series of the history of the Jews of Czechoslovakia. Since 2011, the Society has organized many lectures related to the history and culture of Jews in the Czech and Slovak lands. I would like to thank all of you who are joining us right now. I'd like to remind you that this is the format of the Zoom is webinar. So unfortunately, we can't see you. However, you can participate and send your questions through Q&A button. And Charles will be here after his talk to answer them. And without further ado, I'd like to ask my colleague and friend, Chris Harwood, president of the New York chapter of the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, to introduce tonight's program.
Thank you, Pavla, and thanks also to our audience and echoing thanks to the BBLA, Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association, which supports both of our organizations. And thanks, of course, to Charles for agreeing to join us for this program. It's one that has been, we've talked about for a while, and I've been really looking forward to as sort of a next stage in our collaboration. This has been a great series so far that we've had on Jews in literature from the Czech lands and Slovakia, and I'm looking forward to this installment and to future ones. So let me introduce today's speaker. Charles Sabatos is a professor in the Department of English Literature at Yeditepe University in Istanbul, Turkey, where he's connecting from today. And at the university, he lectures on American, Slavic, and comparative literature. His research focuses on transnational contexts of Central European literature, particularly Slovak and Czech. His monograph, Frontier Orientalism and the Turkish Image in Central European Literature, was published by Lexington Books in 2020. His translations from Slovak and Czech literature include Pavel Vilikovsky's novel, Evergreen Is, which was put out by Northwestern in 2002. So thanks again, Charles, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews for the invitation. And thank you to Chris for kind of helping to get this going, this connection. And tonight's talk is, in a sense, an offshoot of the talk we did together a couple of years ago at Bohemian Hall, which was in person, but we covered 20th century Czech and Slovak literature. And that was the first time I presented something from this translation in progress of Gejza Vamos's novel that I'll be discussing tonight. So I'm going to start off with a general presentation, just some background on the writer, who is not very well known among Czech readers. And then I'm going to read just some short sections from my translation that relate to the themes of identity, which I think we can then discuss. Mentioned, Chris and I will discuss a little bit. So let me begin with just some background information on this quite unique writer. I'll share here So just once again, my topic is issues of language and identity in the novel God's Atoms by Gejza Vamos. And my cover slide here is a caricature of Vamos, who was in his non-literary life. He was a physician, and medicine is an important theme in the novel. It's really, in a sense, the central theme. So this is a little cartoon, which was from an interwar Slovak literary journal, Elan, and this is him in where he was based, the spa town in Slovakia. So let me just give a little background on Vamos. Incidentally, this is sort of a nice, partly by intention, that this is this week is the 120th anniversary of his birth. Just in a couple of days. He was born December 22nd, 1901, in a small town, Devavanya, Hungary, south of Budapest. And his father was an official in the railways, Austro-Hungarian railways. And he later moved to Nitra, still then part of Slovakia, which is where he went to high school. And he actually graduated in 1919, which then gave him the chance to study in Prague at Charles University as one of the very first classes of Slovak students in the new Czech Republic. So this was a very formative experience for him, which he actually describes in the novel in a fictionalized way through his main character. And later he finished his medical studies and returned to Slovakia and was basically working as a spa doctor in Piestany, which is another setting in the novel. And at the same time, he was doing another doctorate in philosophy, and that work has been published as a monograph. And during this time, he also lived in London. So a couple of his short stories are actually set in London. And as I mentioned, most of the 1930s, he lived in Piestany. And then right before World War II, he was able to escape before Czechoslovakia fell to the Nazis. And he was in China, where he was trying to decide whether to return after the war, and eventually decided not to. His mother died when he was young, I believe. His father was deported during the war, and various friends advised him probably it was better not to come back. So he actually ended up in Brazil. So he had a very far-ranging, geographical span, and he became he pursued his medical career then in Brazil, and finally died in a small town in Murié, which is I believe in the province of Minas, as a doctor, basically working for the very poor, or even for sort of the native people in this region. So a very unusual arc, even for this generation that had so many disruptions historically. So he died in 1955, still relatively young. So Vamos's literary career was limited then to a relatively short period of time, less than 20 years. And his main works really came out all in less than a decade. So his first book, Editino Očko inej prózy, which is Edita's Eye, is one of the first stories that was published. This was a collection of stories that he had written beginning in 1919. So basically his student production, literary production, that had been published in different journals and collected as his first book in 1925. In 1928, he published Atomy Boha, which I've translated as God's Atoms. Literally, of course, atoms of God is often the widely used translation, and I've played around with that. We might discuss that a little bit later, and for the time being, I'm using God's Atoms. And that came out in 1928, still considered his most important work. And that's the work that I've spent the last several years translating. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but basically his probably considered his most important work and one of the most distinctive works of interwar Slovak fiction. He followed that in 1932 with a novella, Jazdecká legenda, which is the cavalry legend, which is sort of a humorous military story, a bit in the Švejk tradition, perhaps. And in his second novel, which came, so he was very productive during this very brief period. As you can see, 1934 was his second novel, Odlomená haluz, the broken branch, or sometimes referred to as the broken bough. But this is a novel in which he did discuss his Jewish identity and background, which he does not in God's Atoms. And there's an interesting discrepancy or difference there that, again, we'll talk about a little more when we have the excerpts. But just as an example, he's not very well known as a playwright, but he did write several one-act dramas, which I think the best known is Sterilizacja, sterilization, but there are a couple of other works that he has, dramatic works he wrote during that time. And as I mentioned, his doctoral thesis, he was writing in the middle of all this as well, which he defended and completed in 1932. That was not published in book form until 1996. So that's much later. His last fictional work, Hrušovánski hriešnici, The Sinners of Hrušovany, was a novel he wrote in installments, serialized in a journal, but it was never published in book form until very, very recently. It came out in 1938, and it was seen as weaker than his previous works. His publishers had issues with the novel itself, and then with the onset of the war, it wasn't really possible to go any further with that. So it was never published until 2015. It was published by a mainly Hungarian-focused press in Bratislava, which publishes used to publish in both Hungarian and Slovak. It was their last Slovak publication, fittingly enough. So I want to talk just briefly about Atomi Boha and how it was received in the interwar period. And I have two quotes here. Obviously, this novel was never translated, so it was not very well known, but I did find very brief references to it from two significant figures. And if you know about translations of Czech literature, or let's say Czechoslovak literature in the interwar period, these are two quite interesting figures. The first of these is Paul Selver, and he was actually the first Czech translator of The Good Soldier Švejk, Hašek's Švejk, as well as a number of Karel Čapek's works, including RUR. So both of those works, which also have their centennial this year, were first translated by Paul Selver. And Paul Selver was mainly a bohemist. His expertise was more in Czech literature, but he did write a number of things on that touched on Slovak, and he did translate a few poets. So he has an article from 1934 about Slovak literature. It was published in one of the Slavonic journals in the UK, I believe. And he mentions Vamos briefly. So I'll just read this short quote. Again, one of the very few mentions of Vamos in English during his lifetime, but by quite a significant writer. And as Selver says, the modern Slovak literary language is still in the process of formation. Realism is favored in the lengthy novel Atomy Boha, God's Atoms. And that's how Selver translates the title, which I found only after I had gone back and forth. But I found that was interesting. Derived from the author's experiences as a doctor. So there's definitely a very strong autobiographical element in the novel. As Selver continues, Vamos is endeavoring to enlarge the scope of Slovak literature by copying foreign models. The reunion later in the article, not exactly related just to Vamos, but more generally, the reunion of Czechs and Slovaks has produced the most gratifying results precisely in the domain of literature. So he actually saw this Czechoslovak Republic, writing during the First Republic, as being very beneficial for Slovak literature in particular. So that's, again, just a very brief mention, kind of a tangential reference, but it is notable that someone like Paul Selver was following Vamos at the time. Now, there's a reference to Vamos's second novel in the American journal Books Abroad, which is now known as World Literature Today. But it was one of the earliest journals of really world literature, even back in the 30s. And this is an article by Pavel Eisner, who was actually Franz Kafka's one of his first translator of the trial into Czech, and one of the first writers who really emphasized the importance of Prague as the background for Kafka's work. Immediately after the war, he wrote this well-known book, Franz Kafka in Prague, which helped to establish this idea that Prague was, because of course Kafka never mentions Prague, the setting is not directly stated as Prague, but yet Eisner really helped to create this image of Kafka as a Prague writer. So it's also interesting for him to be discussing Vamos briefly in an article he has on Czechoslovak literature, I think is the title of the article, actually, from 1937. And most of the article is about Czech literature, but towards the end, he mentions the Slovak novel's development encountered even more difficulty than in the case of the Czech, talking about before the independence of the Czechoslovak Republic. Nonetheless, a considerable number of Slovak works of interest and of high quality could be noted, and he mentions Gejza Vamos, The Broken Vow, as one of those works. Okay, so as I mentioned, Vamos left in 1938. He escaped to China. He never wrote again. He never published anything, and I don't know if he wrote anything in exile that was lost. But basically, there's no reference to him having written once he the conditions of survival in the places that he lived later, probably, and just the impossibility of publishing, we can speculate why. But his works were banned under the Nazi regime, of course, but also as a writer of Jewish origin, but also under the communists, he was one of sort of these not very welcome either. And the first work to reappear was actually the Broken Branch, which came back in the 1960s during this sort of opening up of the pre-war, obviously preceding the Prague Spring, reevaluating the Czechoslovak, the First Republic. And the Broken Branch was reissued in the 1960s in Slovak, and it was even published in a Czech translation. And the first critical biography of Vamos was written in 1971 by his colleague, Daniel Okali, who was, I think, actually a friend of his. And God's Atoms did not reappear until quite a bit later. And this was through the work of the scholar Dagmar Kurochanova from University, who has done the major work of re-editing and republishing Vamos's work in Slovak. She first edited and published his book, The Principle of Cruelty, which is actually his doctoral work. And then she produced an edition which was somewhat edited to contemporary Slovak, I believe at the request of the publisher, because actually in some ways Vamos's Slovak was quite unusual, and I'll talk about that in a minute with the language issue, but it's actually an odd mix of different influences, and in some ways he doesn't follow standard Slovak. So this is a somewhat modernized edition. I mean, it still keeps his work integral, work, but with occasional sort of changes. So Odlomená haluz was also republished around that time. So about between 15, 20 years ago, his works have been released. In 2015, a translation of the story Editas I, which, as I mentioned, was the sort of title story of his first collection, was included in an anthology of modern Slovak literature in English. So that's the first of his works to have appeared in English. But other than that, he still has not been translated into many languages. Okay, I'll just give a little bit of information about each of these novels. Well, just the two novels that we're going to be discussing, his two major works. God's Atoms, as I mentioned, was published in 1928. It focuses on a young Slovak doctor working in Prague. He has just finished his studies, and basically his medical residency. So the focus is on Karol Zorian, the protagonist, his very difficult relationships with his colleagues at the hospital, and this mysterious lover who he calls Medusa. That's his nickname for her. We don't even learn her real name, but she sort of comes and goes very mysteriously during the novel. The work was quite successful. It went through 4 interwar editions, first published in 1928. And what's interesting, actually, is that the editions published in the 1930s were slightly expanded. He actually wrote extra material and stuck in these new passages into the text. So the currently available text, I'm not sure if it's still in print, but the most recent one, the sort of modernized one, follows the original edition of 1928. But there are some interesting passages that he added, and none of them are essential to but they sort of add his thoughts and opinions in a way. And one of them I'm actually going to be reading a little bit later that was added to the text. What's also interesting about God's Atoms, it was published in a Czech translation, and this is the cover you can see here of the Czech version, which was quite rare in the interwar period. The sort of official ideology was of the Czechoslovak language. The Czech and Slovak were not really two different languages, and therefore translation was not necessary, right? Of course, in the communist period, it became quite relatively common for Czech writers to be translated. I'm sorry, for Slovak writers to be translated into Czech. Very rarely did it go the other direction, because Slovaks don't tend to distinguish between reading in Slovak or Czech. Czechs, especially when it comes to literary works, still prefer reading a Czech translation. And that is, even more so perhaps today than it was during the period of the Republic, whether the First Republic or the communist period. But Vamos was actually translated into Czech. And again, it sort of attests to the complexity, the linguistic complexity of the text, that they thought that this was worthwhile to publish a Czech edition. Okay, so I'm just going to mention quickly The Broken Branch, his second novel, published in 1934, originally titled Zlatý vek, or The Golden Age. And its main character is a young Jewish boy, originally called Samko, who actually leaves his family, or he's sort of cast out by his family, and is adopted and takes on a new name, Mikuláš. And this was a very provocative work, actually, because it was basically calling for assimilation to sort of the more modern way of living. And so he was really a kind of very secular, although he came from a Jewish background, he was approaching it through this very secular viewpoint. And this is something that maybe in the sort of turn of the century might have seemed fairly unobjectionable, but this was already 1934, and his views were critical of traditional Judaism, or at least they could be interpreted in that way, and it caused a big we might say even a scandal. I think it wouldn't be exaggerating among the local Jewish community in Piestany. And he sort of pokes fun at Piestany, calling it Bahňany, this spa town, which is known for its mud baths. And people were not only offended that, you know, he was sort of poking fun, but also found him as really going too far, going for assimilation at a time when, you know, obviously the Nazi regime was already coming to power. And here you see on the right, there's another caricature from Elan, which is he won a Czechoslovak literary prize, but he only won second prize, and it was split between two authors. So this is kind of him resting on his laurels, but holding the second prize that is divided. And apparently he was, I don't know if he had written something about this, but and there in the background you can see there's sort of a Jewish character that's the shadow. There's a sort of an odd visual image there, alluding to the theme of the work. Okay, so to go back to God's Atoms, just a couple of interesting quotes. One from a Slovak scholar, Vladimir Borik, just taken from a history of Slovak literature that has been translated into English. So sort of a very broad overview for non-Slovaks, who refers to Atomi Boha as the most pessimistic work of Slovak literature. It's also been, I think even at the time, critics referred to it as the most nihilistic work that had been written. Very different from a lot of Slovak writing at the time, which was still very much set in a rural and sort of among this, in a sense, idealized countryside in some cases. The next quote here is from the British scholar Robert Pinsent, who included Vamos in his encyclopedia of East European literature, which came out in the 90s. And this, I think, was the first time I encountered Vamos, just as his name was in Pinsent's work. So this is just, again, just a sort of a general encyclopedia entry, but he says Vamos's main subjects are the sexualization and materialization of life in a world of prejudice and superficiality. His despairing skepticism often verges on cynicism. The satirical novel Atomy Boha depicts a world ruled by Gonokake. Sex and VD are the caprice of a cold, almost vindictive puppeteer god for whom medical science provides jolly entertainment. So there you can see that he sort of gives the definition of the title there, that it refers to this introduction that's almost in this biblical language. God is sending out these germs, basically. These are his atoms of to sort of play with the human destiny. It's sort of this cruel and vindictive, but also whimsical God that is portrayed here. Recent work is by a scholar from the Sorbonne, Clara Royer, who is a specialist of Central European literature and particularly on Hungarian Jewish writers. And she's actually also a screenwriter. She co-wrote the scenario, I believe, of the film Son of Saul, which won the best foreign film several years ago. So she includes Vamos in her study of interwar Hungarian Jewish writing, because he was not only born, he was born in Hungary and his first language was Hungarian. So she includes him as the only representative case from Slovakia. And I think there's one or two writers who also were living in Transylvania, but again, they were more identified as Hungarian. Vamos very much identified as Slovak, as we're going to discuss. So this is a little quote that I took from Royer's monograph. For Jewish Hungarian men of letters, the ultimate identity turns out to be that of a writer, right, rather than any national identity, allowing them to join a literary kingdom of which they would be the free subjects. And that's actually the title of her book, is the Literary Kingdom. So it's sort of this finding an identity or a homeland in literature and in a language. And my translation of join, this actually, she wrote Sanskrit, which also refers to actually writing, right? Inscribing themselves in a sense into a national literature. So those are just a few general comments related to Vamos. So a little more specifically, there's a Slovak scholar who has written on Atomy Boha and actually on Vamos's fiction in general, Zuzana Šalamonová. And she sort of also touches on this issue of identity and in terms of polyglossia, and that Vamos's work is very multilingual, polyglot. So according to her essay, Vamos dreams utopically of a universal language that would be the ideal language of a reunified and happy humanity. Even if he rejected his Jewish and Hungarian past and asserted his status as a Slovak writer, Vamos was only happy in polyglossia. The presence of a great number of expressions in Hungarian, German, Czech, Hebrew, and Yiddish, in Russian, in English, and Latin, not to mention French, proves this. And in the editions of The Broken Branch from the 1960s onward, there's actually, not in the original 1930s versions, but in the later editions, there's actually a gallery at the back of the book with various different Yiddish and other Hungarian phrases, especially, that he uses. And to touch on the issues of identity, Dagmar Kurochanova, who I mentioned earlier, has edited a number of Vamos's works. And she also wrote probably the most comprehensive study of his work in English, which was published, I think, around 2005. And she touches here on both his Jewish and Slovak identity. First of all, as I mentioned briefly already, Vamos's perception of Judaism is influenced by his secularism and its emphasis on modernization and progress. And at the same time, from the Slovak literary perspective, he was perceived as non-Slovak in origin and spirit. He was distancing himself from his Jewish identity, at least from the traditional version of that, and very much identified through the Slovak language as a Slovak writer, but was not fully accepted as a Slovak. His contacts with the Hungarian literary tradition on the one hand, and with Czech literature on the other, undermined his position in Slovak literature. Right, so here's somebody born in Hungary, studied in Prague. His Slovak was definitely influenced by Czech, but also presumably somewhat by Hungarian in the syntax. And both of these, on both sides, he sort of didn't fit into those into the category of a Slovak writer as much as he tried to do so. But it's a very interesting choice that he made, coming so soon after Slovakia's independence from Hungary. Of course, Slovakia had never been an independent state, unlike Bohemia. So he was really connecting with this tradition that was really just starting to emerge in the 19th century, and was not able to fully develop until 1918. And I just have to end this. I'm going to end my presentation here and then go on to some of the quotes we'll be discussing. But this is a quote from the Michael Derda is the book. I believe he's the main book review editor of the Washington Post. I believe he still is at the Post, and he's actually part Slovak American. He's Russian American on one side and Slovak American on the other. And he has a review of, or I don't even think it was a full review. I think when that anthology came out several years ago, he mentioned it as one of the possible, been like a recommendation of Christmas purchases, or I don't even know the context, but in passing, he mentions this anthology. And there's a funny quote here that he says, just murmuring the names of these authors, Josef Hronsky, Gejza Vamos, Uroš Sloboda, makes me feel like I'm back at a church picnic in Lorain, Ohio. And this was, Lorraine is a part of the greater Cleveland area, which was one of the main centers of Slovak immigration. So imagining these as just sort of typical Slovak names, which in Vamos's case is quite ironic, because of course he had been born in Hungary and was not fully embraced as Slovak. And these three writers, incidentally, are, extremely different as well. You could, be hard to pick three more disparate writers. But I thought that was in sort of the mainstream press. There's a passing reference to Vamos, even without a discussion of his work. Okay, so that's really the background I wanted to give. And I'll stop this now and go back to our main screen here. So what I'm planning to do is to read a few of the excerpts from my translation, which is, I've completed the translation. It's still a rough draft, more or less, but I was hoping that I would have a more specific announcement about the publication of the translation. There's a tentative agreement, but it is not yet set in stone, so I'm not going to mention. But there is at least a publisher that has expressed some interest, and it was quite a difficult period over the last several years to contact publishers with this writer who I believe was quite interesting, and to not find a lot of interest in this sort of unknown Slovak. It's not unusual, but it was rather frustrating. So I'm going to be reading from first the beginning of part one. I have a couple of short quotes, and then maybe Chris and I will discuss the image of Prague that comes up here, and then I'll follow that up with another a little bit longer quote from Slovakia. So just to put this in context, most of the novel actually takes place in Prague. There's one chapter at the beginning of the book that takes place in Slovakia, presumably when he's still in high school, before he goes to Prague, and it's called The Three Dogs. And it really shows, it shows Karol Zorian, the main character's personality, that he wants to be friends with these three dogs living in his village, and they refuse to, befriend him. So he decides to take revenge on them by these gruesome punishments. So it's this kind of, it's this idealistic side, this yearning for friendship that then turns very cynical and very bitter when it's rejected. So when we go to the second chapter, he has already been living for several years in Prague. And the doctors there, again, this is not spelled out so much, but obviously most of the doctors are Czech, and he as a Slovak is somewhat of an outsider. I think there's one other character that is mentioned as Slovak, but I'm just going to read now from the chapter, and this chapter is called The Three Doctors. So what he does is actually he nicknames the three colleagues that he dislikes the most. He gives them nicknames after the three dogs in the village that he had this sort of enmity with in the first chapter. So this is as he's going to his first day of residency at this newly built hospital, he's thinking back about his years of study as a Slovak in Prague. Zurian was 24 years old, a country youth, healthy as a beech tree, with a wide, soft Slovak face, blue eyes, blonde hair, and a muscular body. He came from the Vah River Valley, and at home among his own people, he was happy to return to his own hard, expressive dialect. He was a son of the Vah. After his high school graduation in 1919, Zurian came to the metropolis. In that year, the first major expedition of Slovak students signed up. At that time, the Golden Mother was still not ready for a wave of students. The Slovaks stayed in the Capuchin monastery in Hradčany. Many of them knew each other then. The artists and great souls became friends instantly. In the spring of 1920, they all met in the lovely Stefanik dormitory by the Letna waterworks. There they formed a single family. That winter, the old, glorious Detvan was revived, the association of Kukučin, Stefanik, and so many other pillars of Slovak life before the fall of the empire. Now the young people moved in and, following the plans of youth, turned the world in it upside down. From 1921 to 1923, a busy, bustling life reigned in Detvan, a life full of noble, wild, and exasperating moments. Young writers of poetry and prose reported there with their first works. It infected the youth with literature. So this is an interesting moment that he's really very specifically describing how Slovak literature was thriving among these young students who had moved to Prague. And they had revived this organization that really had existed since the 19th century, this Slovak student organization in Prague. And a number of leading Slovak belonged to it in the past. So he was very much, and here the character Zorian is a part of this, just like Vamos was in real life, very much involved in this literary process, and very excited to develop Slovak literature. And gradually, as people finish their studies and move on, this movement loses momentum, and he starts to get disillusioned with the Slovaks, who most of them don't care that much about literature once they leave university and go on to get to follow their careers, basically. So what's interesting is he does, obviously this is set in Prague, but he, as I mentioned, he doesn't really deal so much with the interactions of Czechs and Slovaks specifically. This is this sort of self-contained group of Slovak students, and then his interactions are with these characters, including his lover Medusa, presumably Czech, the patients that he deals with, who he ends up in a section of the hospital for skin diseases, and most of his patients are actually prostitutes. So he's hearing about their experiences, and it's really eye-opening for him. But what's interesting is in this new edition that was, I mentioned, 1934, there's a passage that was not in the first edition that's specifically about the Czechs. And it's sort of this cynical view, in a way, almost a stereotypical Slovak view of the Czechs. And that's the passage I'm going to read now, and then maybe Chris and I could discuss both of these if you had any comments on this. Okay, so here, as Zorian's reflecting on his time studying in Prague. In Prague, they don't know what a joy it is to have guests, give gifts, be generous, gentlemanly. These democratic, practical, thrifty people never give anything to anyone. And if they don't have much gentlemanliness in themselves, they don't even miss it. A thrifty, practical nation without material or spiritual excess. It doesn't know how to make any complicated, fancy foods. It doesn't even long for them, but sticks to its own good and simple dumplings with cabbage and sweet buns. Here, people don't explode, curse, they don't rage, they don't hate, they don't even love much. They just pleasantly scheme in quiet. They wouldn't say a negative word to your face for anything. They speak soberly, simply, without wordplay, juicy expressions or similes, and always in a very practical way. Czech, that rich cultural language always runs along the same tracks. It doesn't allow, especially not in conversation, grotesque wildness, full of bizarreness and surprising humor. It doesn't allow one to form one's own words, strange, often monstrous, often delicious distortions and phrases. Okay, so this is sort of just a rant that he stuck in the second edition, or third edition, I guess, about the Czechs. Sort of amusing, but also interesting because he's even criticizing the Czech language, not just this sort of idea that that Czechs are not as gentlemanly as the Slovaks are. They don't have those nice old-fashioned traditions, but that Czech itself doesn't somehow allow for as much freedom as apparently Slovak does. I mean, that's the implication, at least, right? And it's interesting that he says here at the end that it doesn't allow these monstrous distortions. Well, Slovak critics, one of the things that they were most critical of was his distortions of Slovak, and the way that he wasn't supposedly wasn't mastering the language, although obviously this was an intentional aesthetic choice. So I don't know if Chris, you wanted to join me on this discussion on the Czechs.
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much, Charles, for your introduction so far to Vamos, to his biography and sort of the overview of his work and its reception. And I think it's been a great just sort of frame for us to get right into these passages you've talked about. Well, I love these passages and what struck me most, really, when you put these two passages together, as I see it, this is a novel with a strong autobiographical element, right? It's hard not to see, MD Gejza Vamos behind the figure, of this protagonist. And yet if we see this protagonist as his avatar, maybe, right? This is his other self that he's projecting into the world of fiction. He's made the choice to cast himself as a Slovak non plus ultra, right? That he's blonde-haired and blue-eyed and muscular, physically vital. He's a son of the Vach. All of these almost kind of like just stereotypical features of like a kind of, a young, I don't want to say a Slovak Superman, but just like kind of the best of that young Slovakia has to offer. And as if that weren't enough, in the first version of the novel, he comes back with that second passage you read to show that, yeah, I'm Slovak, and I'm disgusted by these Czechs who are basically like the Swiss. They're completely without passion. Everything is practical and it works right, but they're barely alive. It's a wonderful distillation of these kind of, again, stereotypical contrast between Czech character, Slovak character. So I mean, what is your reaction? Do you see him going full on Slovak here as an attempt to to retroactively win the love of those dogs, and that is to say of the community back in Slovakia that hadn't accepted him for who he was and for his desire to be a Slovak?
Well, it's really kind of a paradox. Here's somebody who his first language was Hungarian, and there's an interesting biography of Vamos by Vladimir Borik that is mostly based on his archives in the Slovak National Library, and literally looking at like his earliest writing, where apparently he really didn't start writing in Slovak until almost the end of his high school career, and then he goes off to Prague. He must have had a sufficient basis in Slovak to understand Czech, or in at least some kind of Czechoslovak, but that he chose to write in Slovak on the one hand, and then, as you say, he kind of refashions himself into this true sort of national character, and it's an interesting counterpart to obviously the case that's already been discussed in this series, but the best known case from Prague and Kafka as this sort of multicultural figure that is seen as this, quintessentially modernist symbol of alienation. He doesn't fit into these boxes, and he's obviously German speaking, but Jewish, and then living in this Czech capital. But what I find interesting actually is that although those identities in Kafka's case didn't really mesh, and obviously historically led to huge conflicts and tragically could not be resolved on the larger scale, but at the same time, all of Kafka's identities were native to Prague. He was not alienated in the sense of real. I mean, German and Jewish culture had centuries of tradition in Prague, right? With Vamos, he is Hungarian and Slovak and Jewish in Prague, and Slovak and Hungarian obviously had. I mean, the Slovaks sort of had this imaginary brotherly connection with the Czechs, but it was not, a sort of native territory for them until 1918. So in a paradoxical sense, the one aspect of his identity that was more tied to Prague was his Jewish identity. And that's the part that he suppresses in this novel. There's no reference to Jewish identity in the novel at all. And obviously, Kafka, of course, doesn't write directly about his characters being Jewish either, but with Kafka, it's sort of vague, right? Just the way that Kafka leaves out, it could sort of be this Central European every place. The names are vaguely German, but it's not really Prague, right? We sort of like to look back at it as being Prague, but Kafka doesn't say it is. Whereas with Vamos, he's giving us this is the Slovak dormitory in Prague, 1921, right? There's no mistake that where this is, and he's being very specific about it. But then he's really creating himself as this man of the people. He's not this Hungarian who happened to move to Slovakia, in essence, who was Jewish, even though he was, very secular in his outlook, and then ended up in Prague, right? All of these, he's sort of much more alienated than Kafka in that sense, but he's denying that, right? He's sort of rewriting this. So it's very autobiographical, but at the same time, he's, reinventing himself. So I don't know if that was quite your question, but that's how I see the text.
Yeah, very much. Maybe if I could just push it a little bit more. The comparison with Kafka is fascinating. Of course, Kafka said about himself, "What do I have in common with the Jews? I hardly have anything in common with myself," right? You're right that when we read Kafka's fiction, we feel that we're in this sort of indeterminate Central European world, and of course, Vamos defines something very specific. We're very clearly in Prague, and he is very clearly a Slovak among Slovak students in Prague at this time. I'm wondering if maybe if you know enough details about his biography to maybe support or refute my conjecture that maybe he moved to Slovakia at about what age?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact age. I know that he went to high school in Nitra, in Slovakia. I don't remember how many years, but he obviously at home he spoke Hungarian, and he wrote in his letters to his father he wrote in Hungarian. But I think there's also, and most of my biographical information comes from this study by Borik that I mentioned, who has looked at all the papers, and I've never looked at his archive in person, but I think during the interwar period, he started to write to his father in Slovak. I think there are actually letters that and that's when he was living in Slovakia. So maybe it was more, but obviously conscious shift, even at this sort of personal level, judging from those archives. So the fact that it's set in Prague gives it this extra, Czechoslovak angle, and even a bit more complex.
It's remarkable to me that given that he, as a very young man here, the book of his life is not yet written, and he can write it the way he wants to. And just as Kafka had those choices, am I going to define myself as a German or a German language writer? Am I going to define myself as a Jew? Am I going to try and connect with the Slavic Czech people in Prague? Vamos has all these options, right? Presumably. To consider, to hold on to his mother tongue of Hungarian, to as he did, cling to the Slovak of his high school years, or to just, why couldn't he have reached straight for Czech if that's where he was a student and presumably was using more Czech or the version of Czech he had in his everyday life. And it's interesting to me that he made that choice. And so emphatically embraced it to say, yes, I'm a Slovak, I'm a Slovak writer writing in the Slovak language. And when I cast this fictional version of myself, I'm going to just delete everything about myself, which is in any way not Slovak. It's remarkable. And I see one motivation certainly is that he must have been pretty optimistic about the prospects of a Czechoslovak republic, that this was something that was going to be around and that Slovak was going to be an equally viable language along with Slovak to have along with Czech rather, to have a literary career in.
Well, yeah, he was very much identified with Czechoslovaks. But it's, as you say, it's interesting that he went for Slovak rather than for Czech. And I mean, people who are familiar with Kafka's case more generally, this idea that Kafka writing in German, it's often put that almost assumed that someone from a kind of a minority background, let's say, goes for a language with a wider reach. And this is not just the case in Central Europe, but like emigre writers today, they're going to write in English or French, right? They're not going to start writing in some smaller language. And there's sort of this assumption that, of course, Kafka wrote in German. That's the only choice. And we already know that. You've discussed, cases like Jiří Langer, where he could have written in German, but he came from this Czech-speaking family, and it was natural for him to speak and write in Czech. And with Vamos, with both Kafka and Langer, it was the choice that they grew up with, whereas with Vamos, it was more of a conscious choice. It was more like this almost an emigre writer choosing to write, like Kundera choosing to write in French, although of course he started much later. So I'm going to go on maybe to the next set of quotes here from part 2 of the novel. And this is the only significant part of the book that takes place in Slovakia. So, and there's a bit of an echo of the beginning of part 1. So in part 1, he has these conflicts with his colleagues. He basically ends up alienating everyone at the hospital with his clumsy, he's sort of this social misfit. And he has this very dysfunctional relationship with Medusa, this girlfriend, and she finally just disappears. So he goes back to Slovakia on vacation. He's hoping for this peaceful vacation at home. And there's various other conflicts that take place with the neighbors are basically having this full-on feud with his sisters. There's like a miniature war in his backyard. And he goes to talk to his one of his oldest friends, who's an artist. And there's a scene where there are some kids or young people in the village or the neighborhood, let's say, who are actually mistreating a cat. So it sort of parallels the way that he was mistreating these dogs at the beginning, and they're literally torturing this cat. So there's this sort of bringing out the cruelty that he sees all around him. So even though he's optimistic in some ways, there is a very pessimistic strain in the novel, as we can see. So I'm going to read a little bit of this where Zurian goes back, and it also brings out more of this sort of Slovakness of this character. Beyond the river was Piestany, a spa town that looked like a long and stretched out village with monotonous wide streets. The romance and beauty of its people was disappearing, along with their world-famous, beautiful folk costumes, which people had gradually stopped wearing. Men didn't wear them at all, only girls on Sundays. Since his father had been an official in Piestany, Zurian had been raised in the center of town. He didn't go off into the countryside, only for visits or on Sunday to church. He loved the people, he admired the beauty of their costumes, which filled the church like a meadow of flowers. He liked to come close to the local people. He would put on high boots and an embroidered shirt and greatly enjoyed speaking with the hard Piestany accent. He connected with the local people from whom he had been cut off by his urban upbringing with a kind of childlike joy. He imitated a peasant. In the evenings, he often went to the Royal or some other large cafe in Piestany in his boots and folk costume, and he was happy when the town nitwits were offended. He liked the old park on the Spa Island and up Banka Hill. Here he had spent his childhood. Here he knew every tree, every stone. Okay, so here we can see when he goes back to Piestany, he is from the town, or the city. So in that sense, it sort of echoes Kafka's experience as being cut off from the countryside, or seeing the countryside as this alien place. But whereas, in Kafka's case, he always feels you know, not connected to this this outer territory, Zurian, he's sort of playing at being a peasant, right? He's dressing up in the folk costumes, going to church, you know, and of course Slovakia would still have been much more traditional at the time than Bohemia. You know, people would still be wearing folk costumes, you know, the best, at least perhaps. But there's this, again, this thing where he's very much presenting Karol as this native Slovak, right? He's really not leaving it ambiguous that he's from this place, and a specific place in Slovakia, Piestany. So, but then I'm going to go on here to his disillusionment with all of this activity that he had done for Slovak literature. Oh, actually, I'm just going to read this one very short quote that it's a bit of a tangent, but I found it interesting. Edwin Muir, who was a Scottish poet, who was actually Kafka's first translator. Edwin Willem Muir, his wife actually was the primary translator, and Edwin was the co-translator. But they were Kafka's first translators into English, and for many years, you know, those were the authoritative translations. And Edwin Muir was the head of the British Council in Czechoslovakia in 1948, and so a couple later. But in his autobiography, he actually he mentions a trip where after the February coup, and which basically led to them leaving the country, they couldn't stay after the communist takeover in Czechoslovakia, he goes to Piestany and he goes to a church where they sort of, you know, there are all these turbulent events going on in Prague at the time, the, you know, rise to power of the Communist Party. All their Czech friends are really debating, you know, literally whether to stay or if they can get out. And he has this sort of interesting moment. So I'm just going to read this very brief quote that Edwin Muir, again, sort of random Piestany moment. But at Easter, 2 months after the coup, my wife and I went down to Piestany, a little town in Slovakia, for a holiday in the sulfur baths. As we passed through the pastoral Slovak countryside, it was Easter Friday. The people were everywhere streaming to the churches. The town itself looked dead. A Czech we met told us he had decided to stay in the country in the hope that things would get easier when set in, a mistaken hope, for corruption works in incalculable ways. On Sunday, we walked out to a church on the outskirts of the town. Inside, peasant women were kneeling before images of their Lord. One of them, just in front of me with a worn, kind, handsome face, knelt motionless, and my eyes came back again and again to the worn and patched soles of her boots, a battered image of her constancy and humble faith. I did not feel that this ancient humanity could ever be destroyed by the new order. Okay, so that's from a very different context. It's from this translator's autobiography written many years later. But I think it's interesting that here's this character from Prague who comes to look for sort of spiritual, I don't know, solace in the Slovak countryside. And the same, you know, event happens with Edwin Muir, who of course really brought Kafka to English readers. So now I'm going to go on to my second quote here, which is from the same part of the book, part 2. And then he starts to complain to his friend about the Slovaks. Karol is complaining to his friend who still lives in Slovakia. A nation of paupers, a nation of clerks. In this country, everyone is a clerk. As students, we were already clerks. A student tried to attract the attention of the bosses by shouting his head off in the student associations. Work among the people, the holy ideals of the fathers, student work, the student in politics. They spun out these phrases like a magician at the market pulling colored string from his mouth. And the eyes of those little workers were open wide, turning toward home with the undying hope that one of the bosses would overhear it. And I shouted too, and I believed what I shouted. I believed fanatically. I believed in it up to the time that I finished my studies. And then a thunderbolt struck my belief. I thought of a strange thing I hadn't realized before. I noticed there were people in the world who had never been members of the Slovak student organization Detvan, and they didn't even know that Detvan existed. I couldn't believe my eyes, but it was true. So he goes on sort of another rant basically about how can it be possible that there are people in Slovakia who don't know all of this valuable work they were doing, writing for these, you know, student magazines in Prague, but for the Slovak language and for the glory of Slovak literature. And then just to finish up here, he gives an example of an experience where basically a banquet that was celebrating the arrival of a foreign delegation. He says, a pot-bellied man was the master of ceremonies. He spoke the pleasant, distinctive Slovak of Hortobágy in Hungary. Did I say spoke? No, he bleated, blustered, and beat his breast. And then here Vamos quotes from a real poem by the 19th century poet Svetozar Horban-Vajansky. How proud I am to be Slovak. Of my brothers, one plants palm trees, the second sees endless ice flows, the third flies high over the seas. Applause, all present, stood up, rushed toward him, congratulated him, surrounded him. Nobody asked him, why weren't you proud to be a Slovak just a year ago? And where did this pride suddenly come from? So here he's making fun of this this Slovak from Hungary who speaks with this Hungarian accent in Slovak. Well, Vamos, presumably, at least, when he first came to Slovakia, would have spoken with Hungarian accent, right? And his Slovak was always seen as sort of imperfect, flawed. So there's sort of this very ironic thing that Karol Zorian is looking down at this Hungarian Slovak for his, for being out and quoting this very nationalistic poem about national consciousness. The title of the poem is actually Consciousness, right? And so there's kind of this paradox in that. So that's just a little bit shortened here, but he says, yes, he's proud to be Slovak. Well, as for me, here at home in Piestany, I've always been cowering and unknown. Okay. So that was from the section I wanted to read from part 2. I don't know if you had any follow-up comments on that, but.
Well, just maybe there's obviously a bunch of ways we can read this, but I sort of see that bit of his kind of disenchantment with his former enthusiasm for Slovak literature and this kind of patriotic identity. It kind of makes sense. After all, didn't someone say this was the most pessimistic work of Slovak literature ever, right? And so it's important for this question of identity, but to me, it's kind of a piece with his disenchantment with all of the things that he tries in the novel, right? The things he tries to attach his hopes and dreams to, and is sort of disenchanted with one after another. So it makes sense that he has this falling out with his Slovak enthusiasm, along with so many other things.
So I'm not sure how much time we have left for the last part, which was about the broken branch. I don't know.
Maybe you can give us the 5-cent version.
Okay, yeah, maybe I'll summarize this a little bit, because again, my focus was really on God's Atoms, but really as a contrast here, his later novel, The Broken Branch. So anyway, what we've just discussed, there's sort of this idealized East versus West in a sense, that the East is sort of the purity of the Slovak culture, and Prague is this disappointing metropolis. And in his book, The Broken Branch, he actually makes another contrast. The first part of the book is about a little boy who unintentionally gets sort of kicked out of his family. That's an Orthodox Jewish family. And he has an older brother who's very religious, and he deeply offends this brother by accidentally breaking the kosher rules. And basically they very quickly send him on his way. And he gets adopted by this older man, but it's implied in the novel that actually after his, that this might even be his biological father, that this man had possibly had a relationship with his mother, who is not Jewish, who had a relationship with his mother. It's all a little bit vague. But in the beginning of part 2 of the novel, there's a chapter that he calls the Jew of the North and the South. And he contrasts Jews of what he calls the lowlands, which was post 1918 Hungary, with the upper Hungary, which is Slovakia. And he saw that the Hungarian Jews had more successfully integrated. And part of that was their acceptance of the Hungarian language. And he contrasts this with the conditions in Slovakia. Now, this novel is taking place for the most part before the war. This is still taking place under Austria-Hungary, whereas with God's Atoms, this is already clearly the First Republic, right? So we're now back to, instead of Czechoslovakia, we're now back to Greater Hungary, where Slovakia is still under Hungarian rule, and he sees it as being this less positive example. So he is actually contrasting in this case, the South is the positive example, which is Hungary, whereas the northern Jews are closer to the Galician Jews, which were also familiar to the Czechs later on from works like Jiří Langer's Nine Gates, much more traditional, even the Hasidic communities. Whereas in Hungary, there was this greater, and in the larger cities, of course, there was greater assimilation. So basically, I was adding this as this example that now that he's established himself as a Slovak writer, he's actually in some ways idealizing the Hungarian case, but still seeing assimilation as the proper route. And obviously in the mid-30s, this was a very difficult proposition to make. It was already pretty much, people could obviously see this was not going to be realistic in the very near future. So maybe I'll end there, and I don't know if we wanted to have some questions or.
Yeah, sure. I know a couple of questions have come in on the Q&A, and I encourage our viewers to submit additional ones that have occurred to you at any time during Charles' presentation. So the first question says, this is very interesting. How would you compare Vamos with Sándor Márai, his contemporary, the Hungarian language Jewish writer from Košice, who has had great success in English translation? Is it possible to explain Márai's success with English and American readers? And can it help us to predict Vamos's success?
Well, I would love for Vamos to follow the same path that Márai did, which was to be rediscovered, after his death, and sort of he had this long run of translations, although that sort of petered out. I don't think he's maybe sold quite as well in the English speaking market as they were hoping. But he did get quite a bit of attention. What was it, around sort of late 90s, maybe, when he was first published. Yes, it's interesting because Márai, of course, in some way a parallel case. I actually wrote an article about comparing Vamos and Márai as one. Márai was born in what is now Slovakia, and I'm never quite sure. I think he was actually he lived in Košice. I think he might have been born in Prešov, actually. And then Vamos, of course, going from Hungary to Slovakia, so reverse in a sense, both geographically and in terms of language. Márai never significantly considered writing in Slovak, but he did consider writing in German. Márai actually had this sort of debate whether to follow, be a German writer. And in his memoir, Confessions of a Bourgeois, he writes about his childhood in Slovakia. So yes, I don't know. I've had a lot of difficulty convincing publishers that this is a really interesting here that really gives a new angle on the Central European experience. But perhaps, once this novel comes out, there will be some attention. My dream would be for Michael Dyrda of the Washington Post to get interested in Gejza Vamos again and relive his childhood in Cleveland. But so yeah, I don't have a very, very good answer yet because I don't have a specific plan. But there was I guess just one other question for now.
Yeah, the question that says that Vamos must have gone to a Hungarian high school. Do you know if he went to a gymnasium or a yeshiva? Nitra was known as a center of Orthodox Judaism.
I'm almost sure he went to a gymnasium. Again, this is from the biography that Borik's critical literary biography that actually looked at his the oldest material in his archive at the National Library is some notebooks from his gymnasium. And it was on the cover of the notebook, I believe it was supposed to be his Latin course, and it is actually his first notes in Slovak language. So it was presumably a Hungarian gymnasium that after November 1918, literally his last semester at the gymnasium, they started working on Slovak grammar. So I don't think he had a yeshiva education.
And that raises a question for me. I'm guessing that probably Charles has part of the answer, and maybe people in our audience will have more. I'm more familiar, of course, with the perspective of Jews from the Czech lands and sort of the linguistic and national dilemmas they faced. For Jews from Slovakia of Vamos's generation, many of them would have had Hungarian as their first language. What would the other possibilities have been? He said that some of them, the mountainous parts or whatever, the Slovak as opposed to the Hungarian Jews were more like the Galicians. That would have meant they had Yiddish as their first language.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not actually quite sure how much Yiddish was spoken in Slovakia. I'm assuming more so than in Bohemia or Moravia, for that matter. But I think a lot of Jews in Slovakia would have spoken Hungarian primarily.
Yeah.
And Vamos does use Yiddish in the French. There is the main character's father speaks Yiddish, but I don't know how much, in the early 20th century, how much that was shifted over to Hungarian. So.
Yeah, that's my sense that at least in the cities of Slovakia, most Jews were speaking Hungarian. Certainly, as you head east, as you get to towards Transcarpathia, I think Yiddish was more prevalent.
Yeah, well, there's the book that Yulia Sherwood recently translated. I just should also thank Yulia, who was a previous speaker in the series and had introduced her mother's autobiography that she translated, My Seven Lives, Agnieszka Kalinova's book that recently came out. But she described, Agnieszka Kalinova describes in the early 30s, the experience that there were sort of different schools. There were choices, basically. So Czechoslovakia had various choices, and I think there was some flexibility also. That you could pretty much, you could even go back and forth between different schools in a place like Prešov. So I don't know how much that was. I mean, obviously, that was more Slovak focused than before 1918 for the city schools, but there were still people. The generation before had studied primarily in Hungarian. So.
We have a little support from our audience. One suggesting that in parts of Slovakia, in the Spiš region in the north and east, Jews often spoke German. And in Piestany, Eva says German was spoken. Hungarian too, but often the home language.
But Neolog Jews are the one of the Jewish groups in Hungary specifically. Yes, well. And Piestany, of course, was not Vamos's native town. Piestany is the town where he worked as a physician, but he didn't grow up there. He grew up in Nitra, but also his native town was in Hungary. So his native language was definitely Hungarian. Although obviously, growing up in the late Habsburg Empire, they would have also studied German. But yeah, it's interesting that obviously German was also had a strong presence in Slovakia. That we don't necessarily think of German as being as strong in Slovakia as in the Czech lands, but yeah, definitely there was.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. Well, I'm going to put a last call for questions from the audience. Well, and in the absence of any, I want to thank Charles so much for his presentation, which is it's been a great sort of piece in the story we're telling through this series of lectures, and I've really enjoyed getting to learn a lot more about Vamos from your presentation and from the materials you sent in advance. And I'm really looking forward to that translation coming out. So I'm keeping my thumb squeezed, as we do in Central Europe, that is going to happen soon and with great success.
It's on the way. These things just always take a very long time. So
yeah. And so I think that's it for me from SVU, this Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences. I don't know if Pavla wants to step in and say goodbye and thank you for the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews.
Thank you, Chris. Well, Charles, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It was terrific to find out about this Slovak Jewish author that I personally didn't know about, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book, although I could read it in Slovak. I can't.
Or Czech.
I shouldn't.
Yeah,
I shouldn't say, or in Czech. I shouldn't. I have no excuse. but I also will keep my fingers crossed that that the book will come out in English, and we will be definitely happy in the society to promote it. And so thank you very much, and thank you for staying up with us as you are in Istanbul, as Chris said at the beginning. And well, we hope that we will have another opportunity to see you soon and to promote your book, and good luck with your translation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss it in advance.
And thank you for everyone to joining us. Also, this lecture was recorded, so there will be we will post it on YouTube, and we will be sending the link to the lecture this upcoming week. Thank you so much, and have a good night. Have a good afternoon.